Today is November 13th, 2024. This is episode 81 of the Sports Daily College Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Mike Koomar. Tonight, Mike and I will go over some of the big games from the first weekend of college hoops, and then, of course, the Champions Classic, which concluded last night. So, Mike, let's talk about the team that, let's go all the way back to Friday night, first of all. They did play in the Champions Classic, but they had a big game before then. That's the Kansas Jayhawks. They hosted Hubert Davis and the North Carolina Tar Heels at the Phog. This game was an incredibly back and forth one. Kansas up by 15 at halftime. Looked like they were cruising to an easy win, but the Tar Heels fight all the way back. They even take the lead late, but it's Kansas who gets the job done down the stretch. A pretty crazy first game for both these teams. How much did we really learn from this one?
Yeah, I think answer, Sean, this one was bizarre. Kansas had a 20-point lead in the first half. UNC comes all the way back to take a 4-point lead with 3 minutes to go in this game. And it really just comes down to Kansas executing down the stretch, and UNC did not. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons for Kansas. They played 2 games where they got the job done. They got some wins in the last few days, but did not look very impressive. So I think this is going to be a good one for them to be able to say, hey, we got the win, but it was far from impressive. Hunter Dickinson probably had the most impressive game out of anybody. He had a double-double, 20 points, 10 rebounds. And then KJ Adams also 14 points. Dwan Harris Jr., he had 10 to pair along with several assists. But, yeah, I think it's good to have these worries early on the season, though, if you're Kansas, right? It's a lot. You feel a lot comfortable going through these struggles and getting wins in November versus going through these struggles in late February. So I'm fine if I'm Kansas, right? It's still so early. It's a great opportunity for you to just kind of understand the game. But this was a bizarre game that really came down to North Carolina having a chance to win at the end of the game with a 3-point bucket that just missed. So really good game, really exciting game, but really all over the place for both teams.
Yeah, if you missed part of it and came back, you wouldn't believe the score that you came back to. But I'm not sure we learned a ton about Kansas. We'll talk about another game of theirs, so I don't think that one was all that different from this one, if we're being honest. They're still finding their feet and their guards. They have Coit, Griffin, Harris, Storr, and Mayo basically for 3 spots on the floor. They're all kind of getting equal minutes. Storr and Mayo are actually coming off the bench, but they're getting more minutes. I would assume that they're the two that are going to be in there more often with Harris, but early on it looked like they were clinical offensively and they were going to run UNC off their floor. And then all of the concerns about North Carolina's forwards were coming up. They don't have much there. But then they kind of just fight back by making shots, getting steals, and really leaning on their guards, Cadeau, Trimble, and Davis. And then it looked like they were going to win the game, but then Kansas gets the job done late. So we'll talk about Kansas later, Mike, but the concerns with Carolina is the forward play, and I think, unfortunately for them, that's still kind of there.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at probably their top, I guess he is their center, even though he's only sitting at 6'10", Jalen Washington. You'd have a pretty solid game. I had 9 rebounds to go along with 7 assists, or 7 points rather. But yeah, like we said, this was a huge struggle for them. I'm not really sure if this is going to get any better as the season progresses either. I wouldn't feel very confident if I were North Carolina right now in your bigs. They've got the senior big Jalen Withers who starts, but he doesn't really have that much starting experience. So we'll see what goes forward for North Carolina. I didn't feel great, but about their forward play, but an incredibly resilient comeback here, and their guard play looks fantastic. So as long as their guards can stay out of foul trouble, they will be in really good shape.
Yeah, I think one thing would be if these guys were freshmen, but they're not. I mean, Washington is a junior. He's been around for a while. Withers is a 5th-year senior. And then Van Allen Lubin off the bench is a 3rd-year player coming over from Vanderbilt. So I think they're just going to kind of have to get what they can from them and lean on their guards to win games.
Absolutely.
And then in terms of Kansas's front court, Mike, between Adams, Dickinson, and 5-star freshman Flory Badunga off the bench, it might not get better than those three. And 14 points for Adams, double for Dickinson, like you said, and then Badunga 8 and 8 in just 11 minutes.
Yeah.
If there's concerns about a team's front court, Kansas will let you know.
Yeah, I mean, if you could combine Kansas's front court with North Carolina's back court, you'd have the number one team in the country for sure. I think the concern for Kansas, right, is they have one of the best front courts. They dominated this game at the front court, and North Carolina still creeped their way back into this game and had a really good chance to win. And some would argue, Tar Heel fans would argue that they should have won this game. So Kansas still has a lot of work to be done, and we'll talk about it more for when we go to the Champions Classic. But it's good to see these weaknesses early on in the season because they've got a long road ahead of them, especially in the Big 12 Conference.
And I think we can talk about the rest of Kansas later. So we'll turn the page to Saturday, Mike. 3 big games we're going to talk about here. The first one was a noon tip at the Yum Center in Kentucky. Tennessee going in there to a revamped Pat Kelsey Louisville team. A lot of people thought Louisville might be able to give them a game here, and it was not that at all. Tennessee goes in, wins by 22. They seem to be at least holding serve for now as they try and fill in the void left by Dalton Connect. And unfortunately, the reality for Louisville is that there's still a long way to go before they're back to where they want to be.
Yeah, Louisville got dominated in this game at home. It was pretty ugly the entire time. Chaz Lanier is going to be a really key figure to watch for Tennessee going forward. He's a fifth-year senior transfer from North Florida. He had 19 points this game along with Zakai Ziegler. So this Tennessee team has got a lot of depth. They're also pretty old, so that's a huge pro for them. Louisville took 60 shots in this game. 6-0. They were 16 of 60. So not only did they only shoot 26%, but they missed 44 shots. That is outrageous. There are some teams that don't even attempt 44 shots in a basketball game. So they've got a lot of work on their hands to do. They shot 39 threes. They only made 10 of them. So you're just shooting a lot of bad shots if you're Louisville in this one.
If you do the math there, Mike, 6 of 21 on twos, that is a recipe for a loss in devastating fashion. 6 for 21 on twos.
That's the thing. They made 10 threes, and they still shot 25%. That just means you're taking a lot of really bad shots. And kudos to Tennessee's defense for forcing bad shots, but you also – that's not on the defense for you missing 44 shots in a game. That's just outrageous. So, but on the flip side, Tennessee, they look almost as good as they did last year at this time. Obviously, no Dalton Connect. He's a generational player for Tennessee. They might never get a player that good again under the Rick Barnes era, but really impressive 22-point win to start the season on the road. That's good stuff, Sean.
Yeah, and for Tennessee, they go to Baha Mar, play Virginia, and likely Baylor or St. John's. Once they beat Virginia, and that's their MTE. They play Miami, Syracuse, so it's not as if that there's a ton of soup. That championship game in the Bahamas is probably going to be their only elite competition here in the non-conference. So that was a good sign for them. And like you said, Mike, they're very old. They should be a little bit ahead of where some of these other teams are, especially one like Louisville, which is 100% transfer portal. So
yeah, it's a fantastic team. I think the 2 games to look for, Sean, for Tennessee is going to be that Baja Mar championship game, and then they go on the road to Illinois later on in the conference season. That'll be a really good game, battle of the bright oranges. But Tennessee, like we said, they're experienced. And unlike a lot of teams that have a lot of transfers that it's taking them a while to gel, like a couple of teams we'll talk about later in the following game, Tennessee is really connected right now, and so they're really dangerous. And I think it's between that and a disastrous Louisville team that makes them look like they're more of the same in the last several years.
And for Louisville, Mike, they do go to the Bahamas also, but they're going to play in the Battle for Atlantis. They host the Indiana Hoosiers in the first game, potentially Gonzaga in the second game. So that'll be an important one for them. They do have a couple bye games before then. And then right after the Bahamas, they host Chris Beard's Ole Miss Runnin' Rebs in the SEC ACC Challenge. So just 2 games really for Louisville to shore things up before, probably
Duke.
before they play Ole Miss, Duke, and then just Kentucky on the road a couple weeks later. So their at-large hopes might hinge on how these next couple weeks goes, considering how top-heavy, I guess, the ACC will be. I mean, there'll be a couple really good teams in there, but it won't probably have the amount of tournament teams that some of these other power conferences do. So Louisville, that it probably will get better for them, but to have a shot at the NCAA tournament, they might have to turn it around a little quicker.
Absolutely.
All right, later in the day on Saturday, we've got your Baylor Bears coming off of a humbling loss to Gonzaga. They face John Calipari's Arkansas Razorbacks at the American Airlines Center in Dallas. Baylor throws a complete curveball at Calipari, throwing a 100% zone defense at the Hogs, and it was pretty clear that got them off their game just enough. They packed it in, and the Razorbacks just 5 of 20 from behind the arc. Baylor wins 72-67, in control for most of it. A little bit of nerves down the stretch, but Baylor gets the bounce-back win they need.
Yeah, for those not super well versed with Baylor athletics, the Bears traditionally played a 1-3-1 zone under Scott Drew until about the 2018-2019 season. And from then until really this Arkansas game, Baylor is stuck to almost always playing man-to-man. They had one season in exception of the 2019-2020 season where they played a 1-2-1-1 zone. But regardless, Baylor almost always plays man. They got crushed playing man-to-man defense against Gonzaga, decided to make some changes, and what a 180 this was on the defensive end. Baylor actually looked somewhat competitive on the defensive end. They looked pretty good last night, too, for those that didn't watch, which pretty much nobody did. But
did they play zone last night, too?
They played zone 100% last night against Sam Houston State. Yeah.
Okay, then.
So maybe this is a new thing for Scott Drew that he's going to do the rest of the year. So we'll see. But if there's one thing, Sean, I can never say about Scott Drew teams is that they are resilient. Coming off a 38-point thumping at the beginning of the week, they go to the American Airlines Arena in about as neutral site of a game as you're going to get. And they controlled the game. There was only a 5-point win at the end of the day. Arkansas came back a little bit at the end, but Baylor led the entire way. Good team effort. It felt like they were cohesive in this game. Edgecombe felt like he was a little bit more relaxed. Despite being injured, he rolled his ankle in this game, so he wasn't at his best. Omier had his double-double. You're going to expect to see a lot more of those this year. And Jeremy Roach also got the ball going for Baylor. So this has the capability to be a really good basketball team. We just got to wait and see if this team gels and how teams react to Baylor playing a zone the rest of the year. And if that is going to happen, we'll see. More to follow on that. But based off of their disastrous performance in that first game against Gonzaga, I don't see them playing too much man-to-man.
Yeah, I think matchup-wise it really fit. The way to beat that zone in that game was to make threes, and Arkansas did not do that. And you still lost the rebounding battle, and, Arkansas still shot 41%. It's not as if they were horrible, but just 5 of 20 on threes. I think it was a good matchup for that. They held serve most of the way, and they made Arkansas kind of, they don't want to just launch threes. That's not how that team is built, so... I'm not sure the defense will look that good against most good teams unless they're similarly built to Arkansas, but you're starting to see why this Baylor team was ranked so high at the beginning of the year. And with the length that they have, Mike, it's not the craziest thing that zone might really work for them. I mean, Edgecombe is long, Omier is long, and none of them are super slow either. You get these huge centers that can't really cover a lot of ground.
They can move.
Zone can be an issue in that department, but Omier is as quick as a 5 as it gets.
Ojonwin is not the fastest guy in the world, but he's also not like Phil Thamba, who we had a couple years ago that couldn't move. So
he's also long though too, so he can make up for it with the. So I do think we're going to see a lot of zone from Baylor really until somebody can beat it, and you look at the schedule here, Mike. The next big game is St. John's in Baha Mar, and they're not a super great 3-point shooting team either. So I think you'll see Baylor sit in that zone, maybe mix up a 3-2, 1-3, 1-2-3. But I know Rick's already looking at the film for that because it's another one of those matchups that I think if you can play zone and they don't make a lot of threes, I think you can win it. But Baylor, season looks a whole lot better for them than it did just a couple days ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the flip side, you look at Arkansas. I think a lot of what I said about Baylor last week can apply to them. They've just got to get more reps and play with each other a little bit more, because Arkansas had nobody left on scholarship after John Calipari showed up, from my understanding. And Thero had a good game.
He was the only reason why it was close.
Yeah. I mean, him and Flan combined for 41 of their 67 points. They held it down. They kept it tight. So I think the big issue really for Arkansas is going to be their lack of depth. So when they get into foul trouble, like what happened a couple times in this game, things really went south for them. Let's see if, for one, these starting 5 players have the conditioning to go all game, but also we'll see if they can start to get some other scoring contributors from this team.
Yeah, and Adu was hurt all summer, the Tennessee transfer. So I think he will be able to provide more minutes at the 5, because Ivisic really isn't probably good enough to play a 5. And now Omier, he probably was okay enough to play Omier, but Adu's going to get a lot more minutes at the 5, then you can slide Ivisic down to the 4. And
that is true.
And they do have 9 solid players, but other than that, Mike, I don't know. Calipari talked about it all summer. I think they're short a couple scholarships because they don't want to develop players for other teams. And already you're seeing, like, injuries, you're going to have to go shorter than 9. So,
I mean, injuries, foul trouble, you name it, right? Yeah. This could really derail this Arkansas team. And so that's something that I'm really concerned about for Calipari's squad going forward.
Yeah, and they really do need more from the guards. Boogie Flan did have 17 points, but on 13 shots. Janelle Davis, 2 for 9. DJ Wagner, 4 for 10. Going to need a little bit more from those guys, especially because the guys on the bench are mostly, bigger players. Billy Richmond is like a 6'6" kind of swing man, but Carter Knox, Trayvon Brazil, and Adu are all pretty big. So in terms of really handling the ball, you've got 2 players. So a little bit of an alarm early on for them, but they are playing Troy right now and they are losing, but it's early.
It's an early one. The interesting one for me, Sean, is you think about the Calipari teams from 10 years ago where they had 4 freshmen and 1 sophomore in the lineup.
Yeah.
This year the starting lineup has 1 freshman. So right now, and given they got a couple sophomores, a couple seniors, we used to never see seniors at Kentucky, but you just show how much Calipari's had to change the way that he coaches the game of basketball since he's seen the rise of NIL.
Yeah, it's not the same. It's not the same as his Kentucky teams. Now, he's brought a bunch of them over. All those recruits were Kentucky signees, but and I'm not sure every year at Arkansas will look like this, but you do think that Janelle Davis played enough basketball, or you think he will provide more than that usually. And up for Arkansas, Mike, they do have a 3 or 4 bye games here until they go to Kansas City, Missouri on Thanksgiving to play Illinois. Illinois has been impressive so far. That'll be a really good one. They go on the road to Miami in the ACC-SEC Challenge, Michigan in the Jimmy V Classic at Madison Square Garden. So there are some big games left for Arkansas before they turn into SEC play. Those could be pretty important for them.
Yeah, credit to Calipari. He scheduled a really tough schedule this year. Arkansas, when we look at between conference play and non-conference, they have one of the toughest schedules in college basketball.
Without an MTE, too.
Yeah, and kudos to him for doing that with a brand new roster of players that have not played much together. So you don't see that very often for a brand new coach to do that. Calipari's doing it, and it's very respectable.
And they have stayed in the rankings, which is understandable. I mean, Baylor's a top 10 team, and likely Illinois, if I had to guess, will be there also on Thanksgiving Day. So that's one to look out for Arkansas. All right, Mike, the third game of the day here on Friday had a little bit of controversy before. Auburn, flying over the night before, had to turn around their plane because of a fight between 2 reserve players. They ended up getting on a different one and heading over to Houston late in the day. This is the first time that I remember something like this happening in the sport, and it didn't seem to affect them. They won the basketball game, but thoughts on this plane incident where 2 players were clearly fighting enough for them to turn the plane around?
Can't say I've ever seen anything like that before. Maybe hear about the New York Mets in the 80s, where something like that may have happened, but in college basketball in 2024, yeah, no way. That's pretty nuts. And probably part of it is that now with social media and the way that news spreads, it's spread really quickly. And maybe some things that have happened like this in the past have been kept behind closed doors, but very interesting storyline going into this game. And then you got to get another plane, and then you got to go play as a team. So you're without a couple players now, and you got to go play one of the allegedly top teams in the country. Now, in terms of a home field advantage or home court advantage for Houston, there's no home court advantage if nobody shows up to the game, right? And they only had 6,000 fans at the game. Sometimes these athletic directors forget that it's Texas and it's football season. So not a lot of people are going. Same goes for the SEC. But really interesting game. And Auburn really came out and played some inspired basketball. They were not the favorites in this game by a long stretch, but they found a way to stay tight. And then Houston commits 3 turnovers in the last minute of this game, and Auburn pounces on them. They just kind of kept close. This was back and forth for a lot of the way. Houston had a couple of leads that were 9, 10 points, but Auburn really just stayed in until Houston made mistakes and capitalized off of those.
Yeah, early on you could tell that this one was going to be pretty close. Houston doesn't really have the firepower to put a team away that's good. And it's just really dangerous when you do that. When you're playing good basketball and you're not kind of going up by 10, and Auburn started to make some shots, pull it close, and then ultimately in a close game anything can happen. But it's clear that this incident brought Auburn closer together as a team. Yeah. And, they're looking to shake off a first-round loss last year, too, Mike. They lost to Yale in the round of 64. Yeah. So they still got bad blood from that. And in terms of Houston, they could have different people put on that uniform, but it's always going to look the same. That defense is about as suffocating as it gets. The offense is really ugly at times, and they do need more people to make shots. But I know Houston lost this game, but they're going to win a lot of games playing just like that.
Absolutely. And the one thing, Houston, that they can shoot better than this. This was a bad shooting night for them, 5 for 13. They have L.J. Cryer on their team. He's one of the best three-point shooting players in the Big 12. He may even be the best. He only shot 4 threes. He only made 1 of them. So you expect a better performance out of him. They've got a rebound, though, from having everything run through Jamal Shead like they did last year. Everything ran through him, and it's a completely different team this year because he's not there. They still have a lot of returners, Sharp returning, Cryer returning, so those are some big ones, but no Shed is going to be a big problem for Houston. We saw last year they completely folded in its NCAA tournament when he left the court. So different team, but yeah, Kelvin Sampson continues to have the pressure on defense, and that's going to cause a lot of problems for Houston for other teams when they play Houston in conference play. Houston doesn't have an incredibly tough schedule this month. I think the only really tough game they have left is Alabama. They play Notre Dame, they play Butler, but I don't think either of those teams are particularly good before they start the conference play in late December. So
there could be another game in that tournament, I think, in Vegas.
Okay.
Could be somebody good, but you do never know. And in this age, Mike, with how good the Big 12 is, you don't really need more than a couple of big games in the non-conference.
No, and when they're playing the top conference in college basketball, and with how deep the talent is in the Big 12 this year, once again, you don't need to have a ridiculously loaded out-of-conference schedule. And you see a lot of these schools, they're reflective of that. You include Kansas State in there, who I think the only Power 5 team they play in the out-of-conference is LSU. You see a lot of teams, not to get too much on a tangent, a lot of teams in the Big 12, they're just going to try and take care of the conference season.
Yeah, and a lot of teams have done that for a while, including a team that wears purple and white that we'll talk about probably next week. But in terms of Auburn, Mike, I just think Auburn's not a good matchup for Houston. They are a Houston light if you think about it, really challenging on 2-point defense. If Houston was 19 for 45 on twos. That
Yeah.
they're not going to see a team that can do that to them very often. And even if you think about it, you should go probably 50% on twos if you're taking good shots. And in the age of analytics, it's layups and threes. You should not be less than 50% on layups.
No.
And they won't usually do that. And Auburn's just the team that is kind of more of the same. Auburn, a Houston Light, or they did play I think 2 years ago in the tournament, and it was a game that was very close for a long time until Houston kind of pulled away at the end. But I think these two teams are very similar, and Auburn just did it a little better than Houston, and that's why they won.
They did, and really it all came down to at the end of the last minute of the game.
Yeah,
Houston has 3 turnovers, right? And this was a 1-point game until that string of turnovers. So you knew this game was going to be tight early on, even though Houston had their leads. They got out in front a couple times, but really resilient Auburn performance as well. You really felt good for those guys to go into the Toyota Center and get a win.
Yep, so we'll move to Tuesday, Mike, the Champions Classic in Atlanta this year, which I learned about at 6:30 yesterday when the game was tipping. Empty crowd for game one. And I know it's 6:30 and you got to give them a little time. The crowd was all right for game two, but my first thought is why did they move this game from Chicago?
Yeah, that was going to be my rant of the evening. Is the Champions Classic belongs in 2 places, New York or Chicago. That's where you're going to get the most attendance. Everybody from all 4 schools has a large alumni base in both of those cities. Why are you going to move it to a place where Michigan State fans aren't around? Like, Michigan State fans aren't in Atlanta. You have some Duke guys. You don't have Kansas guys either, really. And you probably have some Kentucky people, but that's just a terrible venue for this game. So, yeah, let's move the Champions Classic back to Chicago. If we've got to move it anywhere else than that, let's move it to Madison Square Garden.
Yep, and I think that's probably the most uniting issue on anything in sports, honestly. Why is this happening? Okay, let's get it back to Chicago. There's no contracts with conferences. You got to have the conference tournament here. It's the same 4 teams every year. Chicago worked fine. New York, maybe Indianapolis if you really want to get it, but no reason for anywhere else. But this game wasn't the prettiest either, Mike. Kansas versus Michigan State. The Spartans still trying to feel out their new look roster and how they're playing their forward positions. They've got just about everybody in there. And then Kansas, North Carolina was the previous game for them. They're coming in off that big win. They did hold serve for a lot of this. They had a lead. I'm not sure if Michigan State ended up taking the lead in the second half, but it was certainly tied for a large part of it. And then Kansas just has more talent, and they used that to win the game in the end. But Kansas seems to be beating teams that they are better than because they are better than them. And that's ultimately what I'm taking away from this one.
Michigan State played this game just the way that they needed to win the game, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
It
was sloppy. It was tough. It was a gritty game. That's just what Tom Izzo wanted to win this game. So he got Kansas to play to his strengths, which was great. I was texting one of my buddies who's a Michigan State grad during this game, and if Michigan State could have just made a couple more threes, this would have been close. Michigan State was 3 of 24 from behind the arc in this game, and one of those threes came in the last minute of the game when it was pretty much over. So you really made 2 threes when it mattered. They make 2 more, it's a completely different ballgame. So that's kind of going to be the big takeaway. And part of that is Michigan State forces some really bad shots. And so kudos to Michigan State's defense for performing better coming down the stretch than they did in their second game of the season against UNC. But to me, Sean, felt like Michigan State probably should have won this game pending they make a couple of shots.
Yeah, and I think you said it right. This is how they were going to win. Play this game, play ugly. But the thing is to get a stop, to make a stop count, you've got to score on the next possession. And they just weren't able to really string together anything offensively. And 2 of their threes come from big guys, which Fiddler and Kohler. I mean, Kohler is 5 of 14 with 10 rebounds and 12 points. He's been better than they expected so far. And then Fiddler, 3 of 12 from the field. He did have 15 and 8, but it's just really inefficient from these Michigan big guys. And you have Fears, 3 of 8, and Aikens, 1 of 8. Like, it is really remarkable that they were able to keep it close with really, one player kind of doing things on offense. You did have a good bench output, over 30 bench points, and that's going to be important for them, especially because they don't really have a star yet. But you think Michigan State will be able to beat teams that they're better than playing like this, and also they might be able to pick off a couple of wins like this in big games. And unfortunately for them, that's probably not like a top 20 team in the country, but it's probably like a 7 seed. It's probably right where they've been the last couple of years.
Look at Michigan State. They've still had a lot better start to the year than they did last year, right?
Yep.
They were just ripping off losses. James Madison, their first game of the year, was a bad loss, and it kind of kept going from there until they beat Baylor. They're going to have some chances to get some good wins. They're playing the Maui Invitational, so that's always a good chance for Izzo to get out a couple of big wins. They've got a couple of pretty easy games before then, Bowling Green and Samford. So as long as Michigan State can win the games they're supposed to win, and then maybe win a couple of others, catch a couple games in the Maui Invitational before they start conference play, I think they're going to be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, I think they got to perform well in Maui. They don't really have anything else. Obviously an 8-point neutral loss to the number 1 team in the country will look good on the numbers-wise, which Michigan State has had an advantage in over the years, but this isn't the super loaded backs-to-the-wall schedule that they've had, at least in the past 5 to 10 years. But all right, game 2, Mike. Kentucky versus Duke. Mark Pope takes his team into their first big game of the year, while America gets their first look at Cooper Flag for Duke. The Blue Devils looked really good in the first half, looking pretty sharp offensively. They're up by 9 at halftime, but it's Kentucky who comes through in the second half, outscoring Duke by 14. And Mark Pope and the Wildcats have their first big win. Yeah. I thought both teams were pretty good coming in, but I'm a little surprised that Kentucky came out on top.
Very surprised Kentucky came up top. First, I'm going to talk about Duke. Cooper Flag, outstanding debut in that he had 24 points, or 26 points, 12 rebounds. Double-double in your first game that matters in college basketball is pretty outstanding with those numbers. However, 2 costly turnovers down the stretch really cost this game for Duke. Those 2 turnovers gave the ball back to Kentucky, allowed them to take charge of this game at the end. So the young guy had a phenomenal game, but he's got a lot to learn from when it comes to playing down the stretch against big-time college basketball teams. So good learning experience for Flag. Now for Kentucky.
There, go ahead.
A lot's been said about Mark Pope and how he was not the top pick. He probably wasn't even the second or third pick for Kentucky this year when they were looking at hiring a new coach. In his first big test, he got the job done. Outstanding job coaching a team and creating a team pretty much out of scratch after Calipari and a few others coached his entire team. So well done. A huge statement win for Mark Pope and Kentucky.
I'm a little bit surprised on Kentucky's part, Mike, how easily they're fitting together this early on. It's entirely new. They have their starters. They have their role players. They have their stars. And obviously somebody might lead the scoring in one day, but from top to bottom, the starting lineup is pretty good. You've got Lamont Butler, seasoned veteran from San Diego State, who had a big shot to send them into the national championship game a couple years ago. Jackson Robinson, who was the best player on his BYU team. Otega Owe, who's been great at Oklahoma. Andrew Carr, who was great at Wake Forest. And then Amari Williams, who put up serious numbers at Drexel. And then you have Ansley Almanor, who's been a 3-point sniper at Fairleigh Dickinson, Brandon Garrison from Oklahoma State, Kirk Risa, who's about as big of a wild card as there is, and Kobe Brea, who's the best 3-point shooter in the country. So when you look at it from that point of view, it's not surprising that it's worked. And I think their ceiling might have just got a little bit higher after what we've seen these first 3 games. They've totally blown out their 2 bye games, and they beat Duke, who are many people's national championships picks here. But it's all working pretty good so far, especially for how new of a team it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you brought up the point about Kirk Risa. Seeing him come off the bench is crazy.
Yeah,
it's absolute crazy talk. But that's the world we live in, and Mark Pope has done a ridiculously good job in his first offseason to be able to create a team from scratch. Really impressive stuff.
And not only is Kirk Reese is kind of like living the role of being the change of pace back on third down here.
Yeah, right.
And he's wearing 77, which is just crazy. Until recently you weren't even allowed to wear a number that started with 7, but so far it's working. It really is.
I could be wrong, but this might be his first season in college basketball where he hasn't started. Maybe he had a season where he didn't play much, but I'm pretty sure in all of the seasons with Arizona, West Virginia, he started every game. So
yeah, pretty much. I mean, other than 1 or 2 each season. But yeah. He's been a 29, 32-minute guy, and he's looking like 18 to 20 this year.
Yeah, weird stuff.
But in terms of Duke, Mike, Cooper Flagg is as advertised, and the rest of their starting lineup, Malawak 10-7, Knipple had 14, Proctor had 12, just 6 bench points though, and Malik Brown and Sion James are highly ranked transfers, and then Gillis also coming off that national championship team with Purdue. Depth is a little bit of concern for Duke, and that wasn't quite the case a couple days ago.
Absolutely, and same thing I said about Arkansas. This is really concerning when you talk about maybe getting an injury or two. God forbid Cooper Flagg has to go down for 3 weeks. What are they going to do? Or Cooper Flagg gets into foul trouble. He has 3 fouls in the first half against UNC in winner-take-all ACC championship, right? It causes a lot of concern for Duke. I'm not aware if they had any good players that were injured in this game, but I think one
role player off the bench from Rice, but I don't think he's more than a 10-minute a game guy.
They're getting 10 minutes a game from him probably. So, I think Duke's got a lot of figuring out to do if they're going to be able to be a championship contender team. You look at every single team that has won the national championship or made a deep run. I think the only one in recent memory that's really done anything productive that didn't have this kind of depth was North Carolina in 2022. Everybody else requires a lot of depth, and a lot of times they've got more than 5 starters. What I mean by more than 5 starters is that they've got 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 players that can play 20-plus minutes in a game, and Duke has only 5.
And as much as they were playing Kentucky, Mike, this did remind me of a Calipari Kentucky team. With the freshmen, with sort of a couple unexplainable mistakes, a lot of talent, and it might take them a little bit. Kentucky under Calipari didn't look great early on in the year. And then usually they did figure things out and were the best team in the country by the end of the year. But it does not get easier for Duke. They head on the road to do the reverse game last year against Arizona. Remember, Arizona came to Cameron Indoor and beat them last year. They have to go out to the McHale Center and finish that up. And then they also go to Vegas, where they play number 1 Kansas and then Seattle. And then they host Auburn in the SEC ACC Challenge. And that's within the next 30 days, Mike. That's even before they start ACC play against Louisville. So Duke has a ton of huge games in the future, which if they win them, you'll forget about this one real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of really tough games coming up. I don't think they've got a very tough conference schedule this year. Currently, I think they're just one of 2 teams that is ranked in the ACC. It's just them and North Carolina. So, and I don't see any of these other teams really getting ranked anytime soon. Who knows? Maybe Notre Dame can surprise me this year. But they've got a lot of open games when it comes to ACC play. So if they can get a few of these big wins, maybe just lose 1 or 2 more, they're going to be in pretty good shape come March, I believe.
Yeah, it's certainly looking like a 2-horse race at the top of the ACC. And now, Mike, that's all the time we have for him today. We wanted to talk about the Big East stinking again. We did last week. If you replay that, it could be applied to this week too. More losses, more unexplainable bad performances. That league's in trouble. But other than that, Mike, that's all we have from today. Please be sure to tune into the other content here on YouTube, Spotify,